The first American division to enter the trenches was, fittingly, the 1st Division, which went into the line east of Nancy in October 1917. The 26th Division took its turn in February at Chemin-des-Dames, the 42nd Division in February near Lunéville, and the 2nd Division in March near Saint-Mihiel. The experiences of later divisions varied, but most spent some time in the trenches to blood them before they were committed to the bitter campaigns of 1918. We got orders to go up to the front. All of us boys went out visiting these French people in town. We told them we were going to Verdun because a lot of them have brothers and kinfolks there. Some cried, so we cried too. We sure put on a good act because they kept fetching out the wine and cognac. I guess I must have cried at every house in the village. Just after dark on April 2nd, my company started for the front line trenches. Of course there was mud, there always is. We marched along, singing and laughing. 3 miles from the front lines the mud became deeper and we passed several ruined towns. When we were half a mile from the reserve trenches, shrapnel came over and barely cleared the column, bursting and throwing their deadly steel balls into the woods by the side of the road. We passed through what seemed to be miles and miles of trenches, up and down hill, through mud and water about 2 feet deep. Arriving at the front line, we were cautioned to be very quiet, and the French guide led us to the auto-rifle post. He led us into our dugouts and showed us our bunks. There would be 8 hours in the trench and then 8 hours off for each relief, which was half American and French. He also explained the French system of challenging. The U.S. Army system was for the countersign to be passed around every 24 hours, a word, usually the name of some state or city in America. If I am a sentinel and someone approaches, I bring my pistol or rifle to position and call out, "Halt, who's there?" The party approaching halts and answers, "Friend." I would then say, "Advance, friend," and give the countersign. The party then advances and whispers the countersign to me. In the French army, instead of a word, they use a number. Take 7 for example. A French soldier on halting you would call out, 3, and the person halted would answer, 4, as 4 and 3 are 7. We had to do some quick thinking when we were halted as they called their numbers in French and we had to answer in the same language. Before the division entered the trenches it had been warned, Bulletin Number 37, HQAEF, July 25. That military matters were not to be discussed in public places or at any time or place with civilians for the reason that the enemy gained much information through injudicious remarks dropped by officers and enlisted men and frequently dresses his agents in the uniform of the United States or Allied officers to accomplish his ends. Facts or information which if overheard might be of value to the enemy were not to be discussed in the front-line trenches, because the elaborate, listening-in system made it almost sure that the Germans would hear most conversation indulged in close to their lines. Maps or sketches were not to be marked to show our own position. No document, map or letter could be carried into the front line which if captured might be of value to the enemy. One of the most valuable sources of information was the address of a letter received by a soldier. No documents or insignia that might disclose any information if captured or found could be carried on patrol or by raiding parties or attacking units. The trenches, being prepared for long service, were supplied with duck boards for the floors and sand bags for the parapets. Doors to dugouts opened into the trenches and were well reinforced as were the trenches themselves with timber. The dugouts were constructed to accommodate from 10 to 50 men, depending on the importance of the particular part of the trench. Bunks were built with one section above another in the dugouts. The depth of the dugout was from 10 to 40 feet. When you finally got down to where the troops lived, in the dugouts, you were in utter darkness. You may or may not have a candle. You slept on some type of frame that had a chicken wire for a spring and there were no mattresses, and you had your blanket. Now, that was the abode of rats also, and the greatest concern was crawling in with rats, because when you got down there, even if you did have a candle, it cast a very dim glow. You would take your blanket and ruffle it up, you see, and you didn't know if some rat had crawled in there or not. I mean these were great big field rats, you know. They were animals. They weren't house mice. And the air down there didn't have ventilating systems on account of the gas danger. I have never experienced such foul air as when I slept in dugouts when I was with the French. Of course the bodies of the men hadn't been bathed. They didn't disrobe. They just lay down in their regular clothes. It was the foulest smelling air. Well, those were the dugouts. In front of our trenches was the inevitable tangle of barbed wire wrapped around or tied to posts and stumps and trees, or to wooden or steel frames like overgrown sawbucks. These would be thrown into the mass to strengthen places suspected of weakness. These masses of wire were usually as high as a man's waist and sometimes higher than his head. Never less than 10 feet wide, they usually were 40 to 50 feet, and at places where changes or other necessities had arisen, one would find a band of wire 100 or 200 yards deep. Behind this might be a trench or passage, probably invisible from the enemy's position, and back of the trench another tangle of wire. At one point in our lines we were very nearly thrown full length by an obstruction sticking out from the trench wall. It was too dark to see what it was and it was ordered removed at daybreak. Daybreak came but the obstruction was not removed. Instead we got some pieces of duckboard, built a box about it and carefully covered it over with earth. Everybody reverently stepped over it thereafter. It was the foot and ankle of a French soldier who had been buried there by a shell a long while before. No French troops had been there for over a year. The 1st Division fired the first official American shot of the war at 6:05 a.m. on October 23, 1917, near the village of Bath-Elmont just north of Nancy. The gun was a French 75. There was no particular target. The man on the lanyard, Sergeant Alex L. Arch, sent the shell hurtling in the general direction of the Germans and their Kaiser. The first doughboy wounded was a second lieutenant, 1D.H. Harden of the 26th Infantry. The first prisoner taken was a German male orderly from the 3rd Machine Gun Company, 7th Regiment, 1st Landwehr Division. Badly wounded, he died the next day. My headquarters were in the middle of the trench sector we were holding. It was a hole dug out of the back of the trench about 10 feet square. In one corner was a little box on which were a few pieces of writing paper and a candle. 2 blankets hung over the doorway a few feet apart so when going in and out one blanket would be raised at one time so as not to let any light shine out. I kept 2 runners at my post with me all the time. There were little holes dug in the side of the trench where the men would cuddle up and sleep in the daytime, and where a few would sleep at night who did guard duty during the day. Strange as it may seem to you, some of our men preferred to be in the very front-line trenches in this quiet sector rather than in support and reserve positions because there were no working details taken from the trenches and there was nothing much to do except lie around, write letters home, sleep, eat and talk in the daytime and stand to, in the early hours of the morning. Sometimes only a few men would be awake in the front-line trenches out of each platoon, but these men who stayed awake kept an ever-watchful eye over the parapets into no man's land. When their time was out they would wake up other men to keep watch. But just before daylight every man was awake and at his post. This is called stand to. It was just at dawn that most of the trench raids were made by the enemy. Food was carried from the company kitchens in Badenviller to the line in large containers constructed on the principle of fireless cookers, called by the French marmites. With a stout pole passed through the handles, it took 2 men to negotiate one of them. Once in a while they managed to keep the meal lukewarm until it reached the consumer. Bread was brought up, uncut, in burlap sacks, butter in pails, and the other articles in whatever receptacle was handiest. The menu was simple and invariable, the quality first-rate and the quantity sufficient. It consisted of slum, that haphazard melange of meat, vegetables, and whatnot, coffee with sugar and condensed milk, white bread, good butter, boiled rice, molasses or jam. Though food was abundant, water, which had to be carried just like food, was comparatively scarce. One was fortunate if he got a canteen full a day for all purposes, drinking, washing and cleaning his mess kit. The kits were more often scoured with mud and wiped with paper than washed, and each man's small dish towel became even more grease-encrusted than usual. There was hardly any water for toilet purposes. I shaved once during the week, using as a shaving mug my canteen cup from which I ordinarily drank my coffee or ate my rice pudding, and washing my face and hands from the same cupful. Many of the men used coffee for shaving, both because it was hot and because it was more abundant than plain water. The order, which made clear that a cake of issue soap was all that was necessary to keep one's uniform free from spots, under all conditions, could not have contemplated such a scarcity. I never saw such rats. Some of them were a foot long, not counting the tail. They were fat and arrogant and full of fight. One of my men was bitten through the lips by a rat that started to make a meal off his face as the man slept. Those rats swarmed like cockroaches around our galleys. They didn't mind the men at all. I was walking down the trench one day when a rat on one side saw me come along. He waited until I got opposite him, leaped to my shoulder, and before I could knock him off, leaped to the other side of the trench. He had used me deliberately as a stepping stone to save him the trouble of climbing down to the bottom of that trench and climbing out the other side. Nearly all the dugouts were infested with lice, better known to Americans as cooties. The soldier's opinion of these little creatures expressed mathematically was, they added to the soldier's troubles, subtracted from his pleasures, divided his attention and multiplied like hell. There is nothing so personal as a cootie, but hundreds of them infesting your clothes and bodies were sometimes almost unendurable. The name, cootie, was the British soldier's name for that human body louse, a blood-sucking insect. In appearance it is similar to a potato bug, but much smaller. It laid its eggs in the seams of our underwear and uniforms. Our body heat produced generation after generation of them. Anticipating bloody battle, the doughboys were surprised to find that life in the trenches was more tedious than exciting, consisting of work detail, dirt and waiting for something to happen. Generally a squad is assigned to dig a section of a trench. The men pair off in couples, one man taking a shovel and the other taking a pick. The man with the pick first loosens the dirt and the other man shovels it out. By the end of the night this gets very monotonous, to say the least. Long will the members of one working party remember a new SEC tie-in of trench dug for about 300 yards across this front, where, when the stench became almost unbearable, the officers discovered that they had dug right into a graveyard of Germans made by the French just a few months before. But since the corps du génie of the French forces had struck the line following the contours of the ground, the layout must be religiously adhered to. So the next night, fortified with plug tobacco, the platoon hacked out the trench, 6 feet deep, faithfully carving through the midriffs of a score of dead men with pick, mattock and shovel, one Irishman remarking that it was hardly fair to spoil Jerry's appearance by chopping his coat to pieces and leaving his boots and helmet untouched. In one section of a communications bay leading from the support to the fire bay, the trench made a sudden angle to the right for the obvious reason that a cowhide boot was projecting. The men used to hang their helmets on it for want of a better hat rack, crawling on hands and knees up and through the ruins of trenches and mason work. One would discover on return at daybreak that the unusual slush of the night before had not been mud or dirty snow, but the partly decomposed remains of a dun-clad German. We usually went out about 60 yards in front of our first line, and if we worked fast and it wasn't too muddy, we could string 75 yards of entanglements in a night. The French and Germans strung their wire crisscross, about the height of the knee, to tangle up advancing soldiers, but the Yanks used a different system. We drove a middle stake, leaving about 4 feet above the ground. The tall men of the platoon had to drive these. We used a wooden mallet covered with a gunny sack to drown the sound of the blows. Then, on each side of the row of tall stakes, we drove a row of shorter ones, and then we strung the wire. Sometimes we had gloves, usually we didn't, and we had to be careful or we either got tangled in our own wire or got our hands badly torn. A wire was first strung along the tall stakes. No staples were used, the wire was just wound around them. Then wires were strung crisscross from these stakes to the short ones, on either side and lastly, along the 2 rows of short ones. Twisting it around the stakes was usually where we tore our hands and swore at the Germans. We blamed everything on them, you know, from the mud up to delayed letters from our sweethearts. Inevitably, there were casualties. The first combat deaths were suffered by the 1st Division in the trenches northwest of Toul less than 2 weeks after firing America's opening shot of the war. Curious about the activity in the opposite lines, the Germans brought up a special 100-man assault company to investigate. At about 3 a.m. November 3, 1917, German artillery threw a box barrage around a platoon of F Company, 16th Infantry. I saw a wall of fire rear itself in the fog and darkness. Extending to right and left a couple of 100 yards, it moved upon us with a roar, above which I could not hear my own voice. The earth shuddered. The mist rolled and danced. Sections of the trench began to give way. Then the explosives were falling all around me. The air was filled with mud, water, pieces of duckboard and shell splinters. As I dodged to shelter, the concussion from one blast knocked me forward on my face. Before I could get up, I was half burned by another explosion. I had been carrying my rifle in my left hand and pistol in my right. When I crawled from the debris, I could find neither weapon. The barrage lifted as suddenly as it had started and I stumbled on, hoping to get the men out before it enveloped our communication trenches. Almost at once, however, the efficient enemy artillery threw a curtain of fire over our flanks and rear. We were boxed in. At the same instant the German infantrymen, who had crept up within 40 yards of our parapet, covered by the artillery, began pouring into the trench in 3 columns, each bigger than my entire platoon. Hundreds of little lights blinked as the Boches switched on the electric lamps fastened to their breasts. Ahead I saw a Chowchat open up. As its muzzle crimsoned, some of the lights outside the trench went out. I started toward the gunner. Then a flare went up and I could see that the space between us swarmed with men in coal-scuttle helmets. Other Heinies were running along the duckboards behind me. Halting, I looked around for something with which to defend myself. An axe was sticking in a log at the entrance of an unfinished dugout. As I stooped to grab it, a violent blow in the back of the neck knocked me out. When I recovered enough to know what was happening I found myself on the parapet. 2 Boches were holding my arms, while a third searched the pockets of my blouse, much in the manner of a highwayman. Nearby stood a German officer, smoking a cigar and viewing the operations of the raiders with satisfaction. I had lost my helmet and overcoat. The back of my head felt sticky and something warm was trickling down my spine. Only enemy soldiers were visible in the trench from which I had been lifted. They were running back and forth, brandishing pistols, knives and hand grenades. Apparently, they had found no use for the rifles slung over their backs. My men were no longer offering any resistance. I concluded that they had all been wounded or eliminated. I could hear some of them screaming in agony. In addition to Halliburton, the enemy raiders seized 10 doughboy prisoners, some of them wounded. 3 other doughboys lay passed away in the trench, the first U.S. casualties of the war. Eliminated were Corporal James B. Gresham, 23, a former teamster from Evansville, Indiana, Private Thomas F. Enright, 31, an Army regular from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Private Merle D. Hay, a 20-year-old farm boy from Glidden, Iowa. Hay was found lying in the mud of the trench, his .45 still clutched in one hand. The hard lessons had begun. I was sitting in my dugout, with my hands lying listless on the table in front of me, when exactly at 3 a.m. there was a terrific explosion, which shook the old dugout. My non-coms immediately gave the gas alarm. It seemed to me that for about 10 minutes the Boche sent over gas shells, when they changed to HE, high explosive, and shrapnel. Of course all the men except the sentries took to the dugouts. I decided, however, that it was more dangerous in them than out of them, so I ordered all out to their positions and made them lie flat in the bottom of the trenches with the sentries standing watch. The barrage lasted about 20 minutes longer, when the shells suddenly stopped dropping on us and we could hear them going over our heads. It was at this point that the Hun appeared and the men started to greet him. One man, especially, Corporal Patrick Hendricks, who was given the DSC and afterwards lost in battle, did wonderful work with his automatic rifle and accounted for a good many of the Germans. I think we would have been all right if they had attacked us only on the front, but evidently the Frenchmen on my right were pretty well tore up. The Germans must have gotten in on them first and then continued against my right flank. Of course, I realized that we were done for, as I could see that they greatly outnumbered us. But we were there to hold the position to the last man. We did. Finally, they managed to get into the trenches with us, and then the thing had become a hand-to-hand fight, kicking, biting, stabbing, scratching, anything to get the other fellow first. I found myself in a turn in a trench with my sergeant, Frank Wagner, and my runner, Private Dietrich, behind me. 6 of the Boches started down the trench towards us, waving their potato mashers. I shot the first 2, but the third one, in the meantime, threw his grenade. As he did, I jumped around the turn and yelled to the others, "Look out!" The grenade hit the wall of the trench behind me and dropped between my feet. I looked down, saw it and jumped, drawing both legs up under me. At that moment it exploded and tore off the right foot about 6 inches below the knee, the leather of my shoe holding the foot on. On both legs it cut me up pretty well. Fragments of the same grenade hit Wagner in the neck and knee, and Dietrich in the arm and foot. The remaining 4 Germans rushed on us then, and as we lay stretched out, went through our clothes, taking everything we had. While they were at it, a little Italian, Rocco, came up the other end of the trench and started after the 4 of them with his bayonet. One of them threw a grenade which exploded under him. He died a few days later. The fighting kept up a little while longer when the Huns evidently thought help was coming up to us, because they suddenly became greatly excited and started back with their booty and prisoners. As nearly as I can make out, we had 14 eliminated, 16 wounded, 4 of whom died, and 12 taken prisoners, 1 of whom died, and nearly all severely wounded. One man was reported missing during a German raid on the doughboys in the Sicapri sector. His name was Glenn Hill and he had come with some other drafted men to the 104th Infantry, right in the middle of the Apremont fight. He had come straight from a camp in the United States. The machinery of war had seized him upon his arrival in France and had ground him through to his outfit with hardly a stop on the way. He arrived on the 13th. The battalion was too busy and too tired to notice him. The guide who brought him in turned him over and he simply joined the nearest squad. The company where he found himself was just starting forward. Later a lieutenant asked him about his experiences. "Did you get a Boche?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Shoot him?" "No, sir, I stuck him. I ran my bayonet into him twice." "Didn't he see you coming?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Hill. "He saw me coming, all right, and he hollered, 'Mercy, Kamerad,' or something like that. But I told him I didn't come all the way over here to play with him, and I stuck my bayonet into him. Then I stuck him again. But," he added reflectively, "I didn't do it either time the way they taught me in camp, at home." Early one morning our French artillery, which had moved up during the night, put over a 40-minute barrage. We put over a machine gun barrage, and the infantry went over the top in their first big raid. It was the first concentration of artillery fire we had ever heard. The infantry penetrated the enemy's third line, but the Germans had fled and only 2 prisoners were taken. One was mortally wounded and died before he was brought within our lines. They laid him in the first aid station at Pexen, and all day the place was besieged by American soldiers curious to see their first passed-away German. He was a huge, broad-shouldered, deep-chested Prussian guard, and though we shed no crocodile tears over him, most of us will admit that we at least felt sorry for his wife and children he had probably left behind him. There were 12 of us who crawled up over the parapet. I divided them up in 2 sections of 6 men each. I led one and Vic led the other. We headed for a place in the enemy trenches where I had spotted a couple of dugouts close together. When we were close to the trench I signaled the bunch to rush it. I sailed over the parapet and landed almost on top of a little runt who had a flare pistol in his hand. He was all ready to let one go. Before I could do a damn thing he let me have it in the leg. There were 9 balls in that flare cartridge. 9 red-hot chunks of hell and blazes were sizzling in my leg, and I went cuckoo. I swiped that baby face and knocked him down and then jumped on him with my hobnails. My automatic was in my hand, but it never came into my mind to use it. Nothing came into my mind, with that hell's firecracker in my hide. I jumped up and down on him, stamping him into the ground. He yelled violent tragedy. He was nothing but a big baby with tears running down his cheeks, but that didn't help him any. Vic came up quickly and said, "Hey, that's not the way. Let me at him." Vic had his BOLO in his hand, and he used it in the most effective way. Vic was a grand fellow. They don't come any better than Vic. I remember one German corporal who tried to carry out a raid on our trenches all by himself while we were in the Baccarat sector. He was eliminated after getting fairly far in. Prisoners from the same company told me a few days later that he had received the Iron Cross and was so set up about it that he undertook this single-handed show. Sometimes, however, such men were taken after being severely wounded. I remember one corporal, I think a Bavarian, who was captured by a patrol which raided an enemy Cossack post in the Baccarat sector. This man was a peasant about 50 years old. He was shot in the belly with a .45 automatic, shot again in the thigh and had one testicle blown off. Then he was slugged on the side of the head with the handle of a trench dagger and obliged to run about half a mile across no man's land while our patrol retreated under fire. I saw him at the hospital in Baccarat a few hours later, shortly after he had left the operating table where 8 or 9 holes in his intestines were sewed up. He sat up in bed as fresh as paint, would tell me nothing, and practically told me to go to blazes. As there were other prisoners who could give us the information we wanted, and as questioning this man was simply art for art's sake, I respected his courage and let him alone. Major Hawkins asked if I would like to go along with a patrol. Would I? I was introduced to the patrol commander, Lieutenant George W. Hazelwood. I had never seen him before. As soon as night was on in earnest, we moved out. Major Hawkins and Lieutenants Wood and Hill of our battalion were also along. Several enlisted men too. Moving about no man's land I was badly frightened. The fear of the unknown had me in its grip. Could the Germans see us? Could they hear us? Would they suddenly attack us from the flank? We moved down between the lines to a point in front of the French position. An old road passed through the German wire here. We were crawling along slowly. I was shaking badly, but swearing to myself I would not run. The road felt track-beaten to me and I was commenting on this mentally when one shot, then 100 broke loose, flanking us from both sides. Hand grenades were bursting all around and over us and flares had turned the night to day. I heard Lieutenant Hazelwood shout, "Tell Major Hawkins that Hazelwood is wounded." There was a terrific explosion right beside me. I turned and a private lay there groaning. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "I think my hip's blown off," he said. I felt his hip and put my hand into a ghastly hole the potato masher had made. The patrol broke. I wanted to shoot, but could see no Germans to shoot at. In the flare lights I could see our men escaping, running back out of the wire. Strangely enough, I did not think of running away. I was not even shaking now. Not that I was thinking of those things at the time. I don't know that I was thinking at all. It was a case of being in a hot, tight corner, and somehow or other there was no time to think. Soon everyone who was not wounded was gone. The terrible firing continued. A short distance from me was a shell hole. I rolled the wounded man beside me into it. I saw several wounded and got them into the one hole. I found Hazelwood with several bullet wounds in his body and one foot blown off by a grenade. None of the wounded were able to do more than carry themselves. Sergeant Gardner appeared out of the dark. He said Lieutenant Wood was passed away in the wire to our left. I could not help him. I had several wounded of my own, but told him I would cover the opening with a rifle until he could get away. He saluted, and got Wood and saved him. Firing had not slackened. I got the 6 enlisted men to the edge of no man's land and showed them how to get over to our lines, and watched them hobble away, assisting each other. I went back into the wire for Hazelwood. No flare was up. Darkness was complete except for flashes of grenades and rifles. I crawled too far and found myself almost to the enemy trench as a flare went up and showed me German riflemen shooting into the wire about 12 feet away. I lay still. As the flare went out I made my way to Hazelwood and got him on my back. I started out through the wire. We were doing well, the noise of firing covering our efforts until it ceased suddenly. Every noise we made now could be heard. It seemed to me that the grass crackling under my hand could be heard in Berlin. But we had to get out. As I struggled with Hazelwood, he bled profusely. He soon had my back soaked in blood and it became slippery. He weighed 180 pounds and as I tipped the scales at 135 it was hard to keep him balanced. I would have to throw him over the wire entanglement sometimes and crawl after him. This would cause the Boche to shoot up their flares and rake the wire again. We would have to remain mighty still. Hazelwood was becoming very weak. He begged me to leave him. He constantly wanted to rest. I was afraid he would become unconscious or bleed to pass away before I could tend to his wounds. The enemy decided we were wounded in the wire and came out to get us. I could hear them talking. They came into the wire in small groups. I told Hazelwood to remain away from me as I was going to fight them if they discovered us. I would not be taken prisoner. He asked that I stay right by him. If I was eliminated, he wanted to go too. I took out 4 grenades, his and the 2 I carried, and took out my .45 and waited. One party of 3 Boche came within 5 feet of us. I kept them covered, for the slightest sign they had seen us was to be my cue to eliminate them. It was much wiser not to fire otherwise. There were too many others nearby and they would annihilate us sooner or later if we were discovered. The Germans, by some miracle, missed us. When they returned to the trench I gradually made my way out, with Hazelwood slipping and sliding off and on my back. Out of the wire, although still only 35 yards from the Germans, my relief was so great I actually felt safe. I stood up and undertook to lift my comrade up on my shoulder. As I lifted, I would get him about waist high and he would groan with pain. I cautioned him to be quiet, but each lift brought the same result until I discovered that all of his foot had been blown away except a long piece of skin, to which was attached his big toe. I was standing on this toe, endeavoring to lift him on my shoulder. No wonder he would groan. This corrected, I carried him down into no man's land. I dressed his wounds and put a tourniquet above his knee to check the loss of blood. He had become unconscious. There came the faint sound of breaking sticks. Somebody was walking cautiously about the woods. The password last night was Nevada. I heard Major Hawkins say, "Kick the brush and say, Nevada, so if there are any wounded they will answer you." I ran to the edge of the woods and called, "Nevada." I have never seen Lieutenant Hazelwood since. I learned, however, that his leg was amputated at the knee and he lived. In the spring of 1918, bolstered by divisions pulled from the Eastern Front following Russia's withdrawal from the war, the German High Command sought to break the stalemate on the Western Front before the arrival of American reinforcements could tip the balance. The blow fell on March 21 along a 50-mile front between La Fère and Arras. The goal was to separate French and British forces and then destroy them. The British Fifth Army was swept away. The Germans broke into the open, pushing westward, 40 miles in 4 days to Montdidier. At that moment there were only 6 American divisions in France. The first was in a quiet sector near Toul, the 26th had just come out of the trenches at Chemins-de-Dames, the 42nd from the trenches near Lunéville, and the second was with the French southeast of Verdun. Also in France was the 41st, which had been redesignated as a depot division to supply replacements to line outfits, and the 32nd Division, composed of Michigan and Wisconsin National Guard units. The French Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch needed help and Pershing gave it to him. During the last week in April, the U.S. 1st Division, the soon-to-be famous Big Red One, headed for the Montdidier sector 55 miles northeast of Paris to bolster the French First Army, which had barely managed to stem the German advance near a little village called Cantigny. The doughboys came in on foot. "Our socks were worn out," recalled Sergeant Dan Edwards. "Most of us were barefoot in our boots. We carried full packs, our clothes were crawling with cooties, we were so dirty you could smell us a mile." Just before starting on our march to the front, General Pershing called all of the officers of the division together and gave them a speech that resembled, in many respects, a farewell address. "We gathered that we were going into a place where the majority of U.S. would get eliminated or wounded, and it was our duty to put up a splendid showing until this happened. We were to be a glorious example for the many who were to follow in our footsteps and should set them a very high standard." With all due respect to the Commander-in-Chief, it was the most gloomy address I ever heard. He not only stressed the importance of our duty at the front, regardless of consequences, but also that this was to be the swan song for some of us. After the lecture, Barney Legg said he was going to his billet to prepare his will and advised me to do the same. The Cantigny sector was wholly disorganized. Front-line trenches found their places on the map if over 2 feet in depth. There were no dugouts in the front trenches and no communication trenches. My platoon occupied about 200 yards of front in which there were 3 small trenches. The largest was possibly 75 yards and contained 7 or 8 bays. The ground of that trench was very chalky and each man experimented in finding cover by digging a hole of some variety in the side of the trench under the parapet. It was better than being rained on. Sometimes a direct hit on the parapet from a 77 would bury the occupant undamaged under a couple of feet of earth. Anything larger than a 77 meant no further worry. The worst part was the bunch of green replacements. It was the first time they'd been anywhere near heavy shellfire, and some of them just about went cuckoo. They were galloping around in all directions instead of getting under cover and taking it as it came. Some of those poor fool recruits started running away, and the old-timers had to get out in the shrapnel and chase them back. It was a shame to send raw, untrained men up where they had to take that kind of shellfire for their first taste of it. I won a bet that day. We used to size up the replacements and bet on how long they'd last in the lines. One man I'd bet wouldn't last more than 2 days was eliminated right there, first crack out of the box. For 2 weeks the doughboys sweated out enemy artillery fire along the 2.5 miles of front facing Cantigny. The village and its environs lay less than 1,000 yards away on gently rising ground overlooking the American positions. German artillery fire was incessant. One officer compared his tour in the sector to living in a room where someone was eternally beating the carpet. Casualties mounted. More than 2,000 men were eliminated or wounded between April 28 and May 27. Finally, in mid-May, the French decided to see what the Americans could do on the offensive. The doughboys were ordered to seize Cantigny, or what was left of it, on May 28 in their first offensive action of the war. The task was assigned to the 28th Infantry Regiment, which would face elements of the German 82nd and 25th Reserve Divisions. The artillery started in at 5:45 a.m. At 6:45 a.m. the guns switched to a rolling barrage and the doughboys climbed out of their trenches. Cantigny just began to boil up. And it kept on boiling. In a short time we couldn't see it at all, we couldn't see the ground anywheres. The air was full of trees, stones, timber, equipment, bodies, everything you can imagine, all smashed up and whirling around with the dirt. The shells kept right on going overhead in one steady screeching yowl, without a let-up. It was 6:45 a.m. The tanks were coming out of the woods, escorted by the infantrymen. Nothing could have been less romantic seeming. The tanks looked like hay carts, horseless, the infantry looked like haymakers that carried rifles instead of pitchforks. Nobody was running, or, I should say no American soldier was running, for some Germans had come running out of Cantigny toward the tanks with their arms raised in surrender. But the advance was wonderfully steady, and no one was falling past away, insofar as I could see. If a soldier did fall, it seemed as if he had merely stumbled. And now our bombardment let up. And our soldiers were entering Cantigny and the smoke was drifting away from Cantigny and revealing that its buildings were no more. And now our men were walking through what had once been Cantigny and now they were beyond it. They had taken Cantigny. And it wasn't yet 7 a.m. How easy it had been. Information had been passed out that Cantigny was surrounded with deep dugouts that would have to be cleaned out by flamethrowers, but we had nothing to do with flamethrowers. It was a new stunt to us. We didn't have experience with that kind of work and we didn't have the equipment for it. So the French had loaned us some of their liquid fire men. One of them was traveling right along behind me, and every once in a while, when there wasn't anything else doing, I'd drop on the ground and watch him. I never had seen anything like it, and it interested me. This French bimbo was about 50 years old, with a bushy black beard. The weather was hotter than Billy be damned, but he had on the regulation French army overcoat with its bottom buttoned back to the knees on each side. On his back he had 2 long tanks, each with a nozzle, and he had a big sack full of grenades swung on each side of him. He was loaded down. Well, you'd have thought he was hoeing a garden, the way he worked. Just before we started out, he lighted up his pipe, and he was still puffing away at it the last I saw of him. Phi was just as calm and cool as if he was working on a farm. Placid and methodical, he walked along, smoking his pipe and looking around for dugouts. When he spotted one, over he'd go. Just as he got to the entrance, he'd unlimber the nozzle of his can flame and yell, "Raus mit ihm," in a tone of voice that meant, "Get the hell out of there." As he yelled, he trained the nozzle down into the dugout and let her rip. Then he'd take out a grenade, tap it on his tin hat and toss it in. Then he'd fall flat and take a long comfortable draw on his pipe, tamping down the tobacco with his forefinger. After the bang down in the dugout, he'd look it over carefully to be sure it was on fire. He didn't give them a chance to "Raus mit ihm." Then he'd go on to the next one and do it all over again. As mopper up, that frog was right at the head of the class, 100% plus. Then at about 7:10 a.m. everything changed. Our artillery fire had pretty much ceased, but a German artillery fire took its place. Huge German shells began to fall on Cantigny and they raised a cloud of yellow smoke, similar to that which we had raised by a bombardment a few minutes ago. Lieutenant L.C. and I were lying on the ground side by side, squirming now and then to the right or left as if thereby to evade a shell that we heard screaming towards us. While engaged in this futility, Lieutenant L.C. began what seemed to me an inappropriate social conversation. "Lieutenant Sergeant," he began. "Do you remember the date of your commission as first lieutenant?" I answered, "September 1917. "But," he said, "my commission was dated August 1917, which makes me your senior, in which case I suppose this foxhole falls to me." At this he ensconced himself in a 3-foot foxhole, protruding from it like a jack-in-the-box with a broken spring. A French captain heard our conversation and he had turned and seen Lieutenant L.C. insert himself into the foxhole and was staring at him not with contempt nor commiseration, but in sheer amazement. In all his war experience, he had never seen the likes of it. I know now from books that there were during my stay at Observation Post, Pennsylvania, this day, 4 separate German counterattacks, 2 of which took place early in the morning and 2 in the late afternoon. All of which were repelled, but I could not see them. In fact, it seemed to me that all those hours were taken up by one long German attack, which I knew of only by seeing the bombardment of Cantigny that surely must be accompanying it. The first I knew anything was wrong, a big German gets through to me from the right. He loomed up above me suddenly and began forking at me with a haggle-tooth bayonet. I'll never forget that guy. Every move he made is just as clear as it was then. I can see his face yet, all lit up and shining with joy. He looked like a Boy Scout that's doing his good deed for the day and doing it up brown. His map was just one big joyful glow. I was astraddle the gun tripod, my legs sticking out, and my shoulders about level with his feet. He stood on the edge of my placement pit and forked down at me from an angle. His first prod knocked my right arm off the gun. Then he began jabbing me in the midsection. I yelled, "Kamerad," to beat hell. You have no idea what it feels like, cold steel stabbing into you. The angle he was jabbing from kind of handicapped him. I was loaded down with junk which stopped the sawtooth from going clean through me. But I want to tell you, a haggle-tooth bayonet is a terrific weapon. He forked me 4 times and was starting a good vicious jab with a lot of weight on it when I rolled off to the left and away from him. I didn't lose my head entirely, and I remember thinking that it was a damn good soldier who was eliminated me. He had guts to get through to me the way he did. And he took pride in what he was doing. You could see that. He was all of 6 foot tall and his smile showed a mouthful of white teeth. I don't know why I remember those teeth, but I do. There was an iron cross on his tunic. It surprised me that I wasn't more excited. I could see it was doing me no good to yell, "Kamerad," at that hard-biled bozo, so I shut up. There wasn't anything I could do, there wasn't time. He had me, all right. He didn't intend to capture me. As I was falling away from that last jab, my hand touched the grip of my automatic accidentally. It was in its holster, but the flap was open. In a jiff the old gun was out and had plugged him 3 times right about where he'd been giving it to me. He kneeled down slowly on the edge of the pit and a mighty change came over his face. All the pleasure left it. He looked surprised and then disappointed, and then, just as he keeled over, he looked completely hopeless. The doughboys beat off the German counterattacks and held on to the village, or what was left of it. In the initial attack, the 28th Infantry lost 522 men passed away or wounded out of a total strength of about 3,150. Between April 19 when the 1st Division arrived and July 13 when it finally left, the Big Red One lost 1,033 officers and men eliminated and 4,197 wounded. By the standards of the day, Cantigny was practically a skirmish. At home, however, the fight inspired banner headlines. One commander described the fight as a brilliant local action. But even as the doughboys stormed Cantigny, events were already moving to relegate it to the backwaters of the war. Early on the morning of May 27, the Germans launched a major offensive on the Aisne front. Coming as a complete surprise to the Allies, the attack carried the formidable Chemin de Dames in the first rush and crossed the Aisne River at about noon on bridges the French failed to destroy. By evening the Germans were south of the Vesle River. By May 29, Soissons had fallen and the French government was preparing to flee Paris. Reserves from every quarter were rushed to the front to meet the threat. Among them was the U.S. 2nd Division, consisting of a brigade of Army and a brigade of U.S. Marines, which went into position northwest of Château Thierry near a patch of forest none of them had ever heard of. Below Wood. Orders had been received that on May 31 the regiment was to move at 4 a.m. It was our understanding that we were to relieve the 1st Division which had been fighting at Cantigny in front of Montdidier. Billeting officers had already been sent ahead to that area. But about midnight word came that we were not to move in this direction, but that we were to start east in the direction where the Germans had just broken through at the Chemin de Dames, east of Soissons. From reports which we had seen in the Paris Herald, they had advanced very fast and were now approaching the Marne, with the road seemingly wide open to Paris. We left Delincourt at 6 a.m. It was a beautiful spring morning. We rode about 2 miles to a crossroad. Here we came upon a long line of motor trucks. In them were our division infantry, the 23rd and 9th regiments and the 2 regiments of Marines, packed like sardines in camions with little yellow Annamite drivers from French Indochina. They passed in a seemingly endless line of motor trucks raising clouds of dust, towards the east in the direction of the German breakthrough. The long caravan of camions took a route that brought us close to Paris. The people in these small villages ran out and yelled, "The Americans are coming." Most of these people had never seen American Marines and soldiers in great numbers, as there were now miles and miles of camions all loaded with American soldiers. We were kidding and joking with them as if we were on a picnic. Children were yelling, "Vive l'Amérique!" It was a long ride and a hard one. We passed to the north of Paris, and little did I think then that in a few weeks I would be coming back over the same road, wounded and out of it all. The road ran by a cemetery. "Here's a quiet sector," someone shouted with a laugh, "let's take over here." The minute we got outside Meaux, I knew that hell had broken loose. It was the first time I had seen civilian refugees in France. They streamed down the road, old and young, in ox carts, in horse-drawn wagons, on foot. Some of them trudged along pushing baby carriages in which their household belongings were piled and tied with cord. Old men and old women tottered along. Children walked in groups, too terrified even to talk much. Hundreds carried things in their arms or in bundles on their backs. All looked terror-stricken. Then I noticed a couple of steam rollers marked Soissons, so I knew the Germans had broken through there. We passed French soldiers going to the rear, on the roads and in the fields, the backwash of an army in retreat. Some turned their heads away, others saluted us disparagingly, while a few even shouted, "Fini la guerre," and waved for us to go back. They had small faith in our ability to stop the Germans. Well, we had plenty of doubts about theirs, too. It was rolling country, with small woods scattered all about and farmland in between. From many of the little hills a good view could be obtained of a considerable expanse of beautiful, pastoral landscape. Of these woods below was the largest, being about 2 kilometers from north to south and something over a kilometer from east to west. A kilometer is about 3/5 of a mile. It was, therefore, not a large forest, but it loomed up before us like a heavy, menacing frown in the landscape. It was a typical piece of well-kept French woodland, which the foresters had thinned and cared for so that the timber was of fairly uniform size and the underbrush fairly well cleared out inside. At the edges there was some undergrowth and smaller trees and sapling. The timber was not large but grew very thickly. The trees were rather tall. I should say they would not average more than 5 or 6 inches in diameter, but they were set so closely that when our men got in they found they could see not more than 15 or 20 feet through the wood, except where axe or shell fire had made small clearings. Below wood stood on high, rocky ground and hid innumerable gullies and boulder heaps. The enemy shelled us at short intervals the whole time of our stay in this position. We would shoot craps beside the guns under the camouflage and, when we would hear the whistle of a shell, we would take cover in a small trench we had dug a few feet in rear of our gun. At one time I saw $200 lie on a blanket while everybody had taken cover. At this time everybody had plenty of money as there was no way of spending it. When we were up there fighting, they told us to dig in. I did not have a shovel and had to use my hands and bayonet. Some of the boys wanted to pay 100 francs or $20 for a shovel. Gee, it was great seeing those guys looking for shovels. I found a German shovel and dug with that. On June 2 the German advance struck the DOUGHBOY line as French resistance melted away. The Marines, trained in the school of the rifle, peered over the sights of their Springfields and waited patiently. The German attack was coming. A long way off over those grain fields I could see thin lines of infantry advancing. It wasn't the mass formation I had expected to see after what I had heard of German attacks. Those lines were well extended. At least 6 or 7 paces of open space were between the men. There seemed to be 4 or 5 lines, about 25 yards apart. They wore the coal scuttle helmet. Their rifles, bayonets fixed, were at the ready. They advanced slowly and steadily. I couldn't distinguish any leaders. They came within close range. Not a shot had come from our lines. Not a man had tried any wild shooting at long range. Those 10 months of drastic discipline and terrific training had done their work. From where I stood I could see maybe 500 yards down the line in each direction. In their foxholes the Marines lay motionless, watching over their rifle sights. Suddenly, when the German front line was about 100 yards from us, we opened up. Up and down the line I could see my men working their rifle bolts. I looked for the front line of Germans. There wasn't any. Their second line moved steadily forward. Their rifles were at their shoulders. They were shooting as they came. Suddenly, they, too, crumpled and vanished. That deadly rifle fire seemed to take the heart out of the Germans who were still on their feet. Suddenly, they broke ranks and ran. Back through the grain fields they retreated raggedly, and vanished in the distance. German pressure against the Marine line lifted by the night of June 3, but the enemy artillery continued to rip into the Doughboy positions. Casualties mounted and the Marine Brigade alone suffered 200 eliminated and wounded on June 4 when no movement of any kind was attempted. We were caught in an enemy artillery barrage that lasted about 2 hours. Our first casualty occurred then. A Corporal Johnson was hit by a piece of shell through the back and died a few minutes afterwards. We sought protection everywhere, falling flat on our faces as we heard shells come screeching down. That was our only protection. We just had to lie flat wondering if the next was going to get us. One shell landed about 15 feet from me and exploded. I heard a scream at the same time and looked up. It had landed in a hole where 2 chaps from another company were lying. Several of us rushed over to the spot and pulled them out. They were horribly cut up, but not passed away. A horse tied to a tree about 5 feet away was eliminated instantly. I think it was the poor animal that screamed. An ambulance rolled by at that moment and we stopped it, had the boys' wounds dressed and they were rolled away. I can't begin to describe my state of mind, you will just have to imagine it. This is what we seen out there. Some of the boys was using passed-away Marines for breastworks. At another place there was a pile of them, arms and legs lying around. The major ordered them buried. The boy he gave the order to says, "Major, they were buried once, sir, but the Germans' artillery blowed them out again." Along the road came Lieutenant Hermann Zischke, dragging a black Gladstone bag. He had just returned from some officers' school back in the rear areas. And having ridden all night in a boxcar previously used for transporting coal, he was hot, dirty, and bedraggled. We cheered right up at the sight of anyone more miserable than ourselves. When Zischke pulled out an American newspaper printed in Paris, we forgot all about Fritz and his artillery. The name of our outfit was spread across the front page in 6-inch headlines. The paper stated that we had saved Paris. It was hard to figure out because we hadn't done enough fighting to save anything. But Zischke explained. The Frenchmen you relieved did a Paul Revere right into Paris. They warned everybody on a 40-mile front that there was nothing between Paris and the Germans but a few Americans and the whole country migrated south. So when the Germans didn't show up in the Rue de la Paix, the French decided you all had saved their capital. That made us laugh, but our chests stuck out a few more inches just the same. If Paris could be saved that easily, we ought to be able to take Berlin without half trying. Doughboy War he German line had settled down with the skill of long experience. Their left was tied in on an eminence known as Hill 204, their right on another called Hill 165. Their center lay in Below Wood itself. On June 5, General Joseph Degout, the Frenchman who commanded the sector, ordered the Marines to attack the line in and west of Below Wood. The first attack was to jump off at 5 a.m., the second, against the wood itself, 12 hours later. 5 minutes before 5 o'clock, the order for the advance reached our pit. It was brought there by a second lieutenant, a platoon commander. We hurriedly finished the contents of the can of cold-corned willy which one of the machine gunners and I were eating. The machine guns were taken down and the barrels, cradles and tripods were handed over to the members of the crew whose duties it was to carry them. And then we went over. There are really no heroics about it. There is no bugle call, no sword waving, no theatricalism, it's just plain get up and go over. And it is done just the same as one would walk across a peaceful wheat field out in Iowa. But with the appearance of our first line, as it stepped from the shelter of the woods into the open exposure of the flat field, the woods opposite began to crackle and rattle with the enemy machine gun fire. Our men advanced in open order, 10 and 12 feet between men. Sometimes a squad would run forward 50 feet and drop. And as its members flattened on the ground for safety, another squad would rise from the ground and make another rush. The platoons came out of the woods as dawn was getting gray. The light was strong when they advanced into the open wheat, now all starred with dewy poppies, red as blood. One old non-com, was it Jerry Finnegan of the 49th, had out a can of salmon, hoarded somehow against hard times. He haggled it open with his bayonet and went forward so, eating chunks of goldfish from the point of that wicked knife. Finnegan. His platoon commander, a young gentleman inclined to peevishness before he'd had his morning coffee, was annoyed. When you are quite through with your refreshments, you can damn well fix that bayonet and get on with the war. Aye, sir. Finnegan was an old Haitian soldier, and had a breezy manner with very young lieutenants. Lieutenant want some? 2 hours later Sergeant Jerry Finnegan lay passed away across a Maxim gun with his bayonet in the body of the gunner. I was in the first platoon and our platoon was on the right flank of the company, so we advanced a little too fast for the rest of the company and Captain Donald Duncan, came over and made us halt till the rest of the company got on line with us. At that time we were within 600 yards of our objective. While he was over talking to Mr. Lockhart, our platoon leader, the bullets were singing all around us and I asked him, as a joke, if he thought we would see much action. He said, "Oh, yes, we will give and take. But be sure you take more than you give." I guess he meant lives. Anyway, he started down the hill and it was not a minute till down he went. The top soldier was with him all the time and I was there in a jiffy. We got a naval doctor, a hospital apprentice, the top and myself and carried him to a small clump of trees. All the time he was gasping, hit through the stomach. We no more than laid him on the ground when a big 8-inch shell came in and eliminated all but myself. I was knocked down, but my helmet saved me. So I left them and rejoined my platoon, just in time to enter the town and get a bullet through my cartridge belt, and exploded 3 shells, but still untouched. At last Fritz took me down, with gas. We started off in trench warfare formation, the only formation we knew, which consisted of 4 waves with the first wave and all waves holding their rifles at what is called high port, not even aiming or firing or hip firing or anything like that. And the first wave, consisting of riflemen and hand grenadiers that were supposed to throw hand grenades to protect the riflemen, the second wave consisting of rifle grenadiers, people who had rifle grenades and riflemen, and then the third wave duplicating the first wave, and the fourth wave duplicating the second wave, with 75 meters between the first wave and the second wave, and then actually the third and fourth waves are replacements for first and second wave. Now we got out of these woods and we moved towards Below Woods, which we could see at this high point, nobody firing a shot. Bayonets fixed, moving at a low steady cadence that we had been taught to move, because theoretically a barrage is shooting in front of you and you don't want to go too fast or you'll walk into your own barrage. On our left, approximately 200 yards, and I've checked this in peacetime, was the redoubt of Below Woods. It's an eminence, a little raised place. The little hunting lodge was up there. It's a rocky place. It was teeming with machine guns, I mean it seemed that way. And nobody, literally nobody was firing a shot at these Germans. They had us enfiladed. They were to our left front, and as we got out far enough, we were perfectly enfiladed from them. So it was absolutely like a shooting gallery and not a single Marine of ours firing a shot. We weren't trained that way. We went on. Well, of course, as soon as we came out of this first band of woods in my platoon, there were approximately 52 men, there were only 6 people got across the first 75 yards. All the rest were eliminated, wounded and pinned down. I mean we were down into a ravine which was perfectly enfiladed and just bloop, a few machine guns, and that was it. So the lieutenant and I stopped halfway across this ravine behind some cordwood to get our bearings and then moved on and then got up beyond this, which is still under 100 yards. The lieutenant looked around and said, "Where the hell is my platoon?" Well, his platoon was mostly eliminated and wounded, there were 6 of us. He said, "I'm going on back." Well, he told me to stick with him, and I thought, here's where you and I part company, because we just got across this place, and that's the last thing I'm going to do, go back. Nobody ever got in trouble for going toward the enemy. There was yelling and swearing in the wheat, and the lines, much thinned, got into the woods. Some grenades went off, there was screaming and a tumult, and the taka-taka-taka-taka of the Maxim guns died down. Then the men who mounted the slope found themselves in a cleared area, full of orderly French wood piles, and apparently there was a machine gun to every wood pile. Jerry Finnegan died here, sprawled across one of them. Lieutenant Summers died here. One lieutenant found himself behind a wood pile with a big auto rifleman. Just across from them, very near, a machine gun behind another wood pile was searching for them. The lieutenant, all his world narrowed to that little place, peered vainly for a loophole. The sticks were jumping and shaking as the Maxim flailed them, bullets rang under his helmet. "Here, Morgan," he said, "I'll poke my tin hat around this side, and you watch and see if you can get the chow-chat on them." He stuck the helmet on his bayonet and thrust it out. Something struck it violently from the point, and the rifle made his fingers tingle. The chow-chat went off, once. In the same breath there was an odd noise above him, the machine gun. He looked up. Morgan's body was slumping down to its knees, it leaned forward against the wood, the chow-chat, still grasped in a clenched hand, coming to the ground but first. The man's head was gone from the eyes up. His helmet slid stickily back over his combat pack and lay on the ground. "My mother," reflected the lieutenant, "will never find my grave in this place." He picked up the chow-chat, and examined it professionally, noting a spatter of little thick red drops on the breech, and the fact that the clip showed 1 round expended. The charging handle was back. He got to his feet with deliberation, laid the gun across the wood pile and sighted. 3 Boche with very red faces. Their eyes looked pale under their deep helmets. He gave them the whole clip, and they appeared to wilt. Then he came away from there. Later he was in the little run at the foot of the hill with 3 men, all wounded. He never knew how he got there. It just happened. Wounded began trickling back. They told conflicting stories. Some were cheerful and said our gang was licking hell out of the Boche. But a few seemed depressed, telling stories of whole platoons being wiped out by machine guns. We gave them cigarettes and went back and sat in our holes. In order to keep as close to the ground as possible, I had swung my chin to the right so that I was pushing forward with my left cheek flat against the ground, and in order to accommodate this position of the head, I had moved my steel helmet over so that it covered part of my face on the right. Then there came a crash. It sounded to me like someone had dropped a glass bottle into a porcelain bathtub. A barrel of whitewash tipped over and it seemed that everything in the world turned white. That was the sensation. I did not recognize it because I have often been led to believe and often heard it said that when one receives a blow on the head everything turns black. I did not know then, as I know now, that a bullet striking the ground immediately under my left cheekbone, had ricocheted upward, going completely through the left eye and then crashing out through my forehead, leaving the eyeball and upper eyelid completely halved, the lower eyelid torn away, and a compound fracture of the skull. I began to take stock of my condition. During my year or more along the fronts I had been through many hospitals, and from my observations in those institutions I had cultivated a keen distaste for one thing: gas gangrene. I had learned from doctors its fatal and horrible results, and I also had learned from them that it was caused by germs which exist in large quantities in any ground that has been under artificial cultivation for a long period. Such was the character of the very field I was lying in, and I came to the realization that the wound in the left side of my face and head was resting flatly on the soil. With my right hand I drew up my British box respirator or gas mask and placed this under my head. Thus I rested with more confidence, although the machine gun lead continued to pass in sheets through the tops of the oats not 2 or 3 inches above my head. Those guns were not 100 yards away, and they seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. 20 feet away on my left a wounded Marine was lying. Occasionally I would open my right eye for a painful look in his direction. He was wounded and apparently unconscious. His pack, the khaki doll, was still strapped between his shoulders. Unconsciously he was doing that which all wounded men do, that is, to assume the position that is most comfortable. He was trying to roll over on his back. But the pack was on his back, and every time he would roll over on this it would elevate his body into full view of the German gunners. Then a withering hail of lead would sweep the field. It so happened that I was lying immediately in line between those German guns and this unconscious moving target. As the Marine would roll over on top of the pack, his chest would be exposed to the fire. I could see the buttons fly from his tunic and one of the shoulder straps of the backpack part as the sprays of lead struck him. He would limply roll off the pack over on his side. I found myself wishing that he would lie still, as every movement of his brought those streams of bullets closer and closer to my head. Sometimes there were lulls in the firing. During those periods of comparative quiet, I could hear the occasional moan of other wounded in that field. Very few of them cried out, and it seemed to me that those who did were unconscious when they did it. One man in particular had a long, low groan. I could not see him, yet I felt he was lying somewhere close to me. In the quiet intervals, his unconscious expression of pain reminded me of the sound I had once heard made by a calf which had been tied by a short rope to a tree. The animal had strayed round and round the tree until its entanglements in the rope had left it a helpless prisoner. The groan of that unseen, unconscious wounded American who laid near me on the field that evening sounded exactly like the pitiful bawl of that calf. I felt that I'd hit my knee on a rock, and I looked down and found there wasn't any rocks. I found that a machine gun bullet had creased my knee. By this time we were reduced to an automatic rifleman and myself. There were 2 of us. I couldn't run. It felt as if somebody had hit me with a baseball bat right across the kneecap, a terrific blow, but no pain. While I was out there, a friend of mine, his name was Pilcher, had been hit and was crying and moaning. I asked him where he was hit, and he said in the stomach. I said, "Well, now, you just stay right there and I will come back after dark and pick you up." So I got into Below Woods, and there it was just as quiet as it is out here in my garden right now. There wasn't any shooting going on, there wasn't anybody there or anything else. There was just nobody there, and there wasn't a shot being fired. Well, I became frightened for the first time. All by myself, and I knew I was pretty close to Germans, so I headed back to Lucy to a dressing station to get my wound dressed. By that time it was paining a bit and it wasn't easy to walk. So I went in there and they tagged me to go to a hospital. But I said, "No, I'm going back to pick up Sergeant Pilcher." So I got a hold of a stretcher, there were no stretcher bearers, and one man, and we went on back. Well, now it's dark and I found my way by sort of instinct back to this wheat field. It's quite dark now, so I started calling to Pilcher. And then all the machine guns that had been shooting at me at 6 o'clock started shooting at me again at 11 o'clock. And I said to myself, of all the screwy situations. Here you got out of this thing once. You're right back where you started from. So I stopped calling, and I felt around and I found Pilcher. I came across him, but he was passed away. That was quite a shock. I shook his body. I said, "Pilcher, here we are. I've got a stretcher. We're going to take care of you now." But he was passed away. Urgent Pilcher was only one among many American remains lying out among the poppies. The Marines took Hill 142 just west of Below Wood, the town of Bresches and a small section of the wood itself, but it cost them 1,087 casualties. June 6, 1918, was to remain the costliest single day in Marine Corps history until the landing at Tarawa 25 years later. And still it wasn't over. For the next 20 days the 2 ND Division's Marine Brigade battled for the wood. Still the men clambered out of their shallow foxholes, not so facetiously called graves, and formed up for attack after attack. They were opposed by members of the German 10th Division, the 461st Regiment of the 237th Division, the 28th Division and finally by the 87th Division, which came in to relieve the survivors of the 237th and 28th, breasting the ripened wheat north of the Bois de Champlain. We passed away men, plenty of them. A German here and there, and whole squads of Americans. The Yankees had apparently been on a course at right angles to the one we were following, so must have been eliminated in the attack of the day before. Behind a handful of saplings lay an officer and 3 men. The officer had been hit high up on the thigh, had pulled down his pants to dress the wound, but had passed away before being able to stop the blood. We went into hot fighting on June 11 at 2 a.m. A few hours before I had been on a detail that was bringing up hot coffee from the rear. Hand grenades were distributed and then Captain L.W. Williams lined us up in combat formation. Soon we were going single file through the woods and charging across the open area to where the Germans were secluded in their holes. My duties were to load a Chauchat, or French automatic rifle. You could run about 9 steps and then another clip would have to be inserted. Bullets slit my canteen, hit my scabbard and 2 or 3 went through my trousers without touching me. We had advanced in triangle formation about half a mile. I was in the front of the V when 3 machine gun bullets got me. One went into the neck, another in my left shoulder and the third in my arm. I tried to keep on in assisting the operation of the automatic, but the blood came up in my throat. I forced my way back and hid in a shell hole in the woods until a little Marine found me. This fellow dragged me 500 yards on his shoulder to a first aid dugout. There a shelter half was used as a stretcher and I was taken back to a larger dressing station. Our men were yelling as if they were in a football game. We crossed an open space of nearly a mile when we discovered we had hit the German second-line trench. Still we kept going. Of the 25 who were with me, only 4 remained. Suddenly we spotted a machine gun. Without a thought, the 4 of us started to charge it. 2 of the men were eliminated instantly. I was shot in the right leg. The last man escaped. I lay wounded for nearly an hour. For a while I hardly dared to breath. I was right in line with the machine gun's fire. The bullets sped past my ears so closely that I couldn't hear them whiz or buzz. There was nothing but a loud crackety-crack-crack as they went by. It was just like having your head near the muzzle of the gun. Soon the camouflage, consisting of high weeds, around me was shot away. Fortunately, the machine gun tried for another target about that time and ceased firing in my direction. I tried to crawl off, but couldn't make it very far. I heard a noise, a sort of moaning and crying. We listened to hear where it came from. There, out in a shell hole, was one of our buglers acting as a runner, with a leg shot off. I put a tourniquet on his leg to stop the flow of blood, gave him my canteen of water, and left him. 2 runners were sent out, a boy by the name of Reynolds and myself. We both started out with a message apiece to the same commander, 2 different routes. I delivered my message and on my way back I came across Reynolds. He had suffered a fatal injury. We did not have anything to eat. I rolled him over and looked in his pack for bacon and found only a set of barber tools. We came across a German officer seated comfortably with his knees crossed. Before him was spread a little field table on which was cake, jam, cookies and a fine array of food. A knife and fork was in either hand. Beside the officer was seated a large, bulky sergeant who had been knitting socks. The darning needles were still between his fingers. Both had suffered fatal injuries from a large shell. Captain Charlie Dunbeck told me how Lieutenant Heiser had passed away. Leading an attack on a German machine gun nest, Heiser had been fatally struck. Going through a barrage with a message, I kept throwing myself flat when one burst close to me. Once I fell right on top of a passed-away German. His features were badly damaged. We got a lot of prisoners and they were mighty glad to be captured, at least, they said they were. I was talking to one in the ambulance who said that the war is over for them. He also said that he was going to get his family from Berlin and come to the States after the war. I told him to get that idea entirely out of his head, as we were going to detain them as fast as they came. Just 2 hours before he had been overpowering our men with a machine gun, and now he is figuring on going to America to live in peace. Can you beat that for nerve? I met a sergeant who had 2 prisoners. Here, Corporal, take them, I'm in an awful hurry. So am I, Sarge, I says. I saw him a few minutes later. I asked him who took those prisoners back. He said, oh, they had the dropsy disease. They both passed away of heart failure. Once, when we were going to attack on June 23, and I had gone forward to reconnoiter, I passed an American soldier who had suffered fatal injuries, and the area showed signs of heavy fighting. Upon bringing my platoon up to its line of departure, I made a detour so that the platoon would not have to pass through that area, and it seemed that so many of the first to be lost in battle were the really nice ones. We wondered why that should be, and I even asked the chaplain about this and he said, it's in the book. When your time comes, you'll be called. I used to read my pocket testament often, and asked him many questions, finding some comfort in his presence. We found only a handful of Marines holding these woods, the rest had been eliminated or wounded, and they told us they had had no time to string barbed wire and that the enemy was approximately 500 yards away. This part of the woods was literally covered with passed-away enemy soldiers and Marines, and the stench from these remains was sickening, causing many of us to vomit. There was no protection here at all, and the Marines had used the drainage gullies alongside the cow paths for foxhole protection, gathering pieces of trees torn apart by shellfire and laying them over these gullies, safe from shrapnel but no good for direct hits. There was no time to bury the passed away because the enemy shelled the woods continually, as we discovered when making the relief. The expressions on the faces of some of these passed away were frightening, and German and American equipment was strewn all over the woods. The Marines, who were getting ready to go to the rear, also told us that a lot of their buddies had been wounded or eliminated by tree splinters, so we had to stay under the roofs of these quickly made foxholes as much as possible. The passed away out in the wheat fields near below wood laid where they had fallen, and we had no chance to bury them. There were Frenchmen, Marines, and Germans laying together, including one place with a Marine corporal and 3 Germans lying together in a heap, and at another place a Marine in a prone position with his rifle to his shoulder and finger on the trigger, just as he passed away, and another with his bayonet still in a German, and both passed away. Alarm clock Bill from Chicago, I forget his name, but a shell caused a devastating blast under him and we found only his shoe. Young Ven from Detroit and Beatty from the same state, coming out of Boreshes, a shell caused a devastating blast under both of them. Ven was only 17 years old, he got in as a bugler and changed for a rifle. The only thing left alive in Lucy was a chicken. We took it and kept it for the 3rd Battalion pet. Some of the boys heard I had barber tools, their hair was getting all matted up under their helmet and they asked me to cut it. Okay, we were standing in some foxholes when they asked me. I sat on the parapet and they stood up and I gave 15 or 16 of them a haircut apiece. One bozo says, "Ho, the last guy who cut my hair got eliminated. He didn't get no haircut from me." Taken from an intelligence report of the German Army headquarters, June 17, 1918. Examination of prisoners of the 2nd American Infantry Division, from the 5th, 6th, 9th and 23rd Regiments, captured from June 5 to 14 in the Bouresches sector. The 2nd American Division may be classed as a very good division, perhaps even as assault troops. The various attacks of both regiments on Belleau Wood were carried out with dash and recklessness. The moral effect of our firearms did not materially check the advances of the enemy. The nerves of the Americans are still unshaken. Value of the individual. The individual soldiers are very good. They are healthy, vigorous and physically well-developed men, ages ranging from 18 to 28, who at present lack only necessary training to make them redoubtable opponents. The troops are fresh and full of straightforward confidence. A remark of one of the prisoners is indicative of their spirit: we eliminated or get eliminated. Morale. The prisoners in general make an alert and pleasing impression. Regarding military matters, however, they do not show the slightest interest. Their superiors keep them purposely without knowledge of the military subjects. For example, most of them have never seen a map. They are no longer able to describe the villages and roads through which they marched. Their idea of the organization of their unit is entirely confused. For example, one of them told us that his brigade had 6 regiments and his division 24. They still regard the war from the point of view of the Big Brother, who comes to help his hard-pressed brethren and is therefore welcomed everywhere. A certain moral background is not lacking. The majority of the prisoners simply took as a matter of course that they have come to Europe to defend their country. Only a few of the troops are of pure American origin. The majority is of German, Dutch and Italian parentage, but these semi-Americans, almost all of whom were born in America and never have been in Europe before, fully feel themselves to be true-born sons of their country. Dearest folks, still out, thank heaven, hope we get a good long rest. The hardships and dangers we endured, and they were not light, seem as nothing to the thought that we were among those few thousand devoted Americans who saved Paris and perhaps the whole outcome of the war. We do not talk much about it, but way deep down in our hearts we believe it. I started this letter hours ago, but have had so many brother officers dropping in for visits that I could not finish. We are so happy to